The ballroom of the prestigious Lexington Grand Hotel was alive with opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting shimmering light over the grand marble floors. The air was filled with soft classical music, the hum of conversation, and the occasional pop of a champagne bottle being opened. It was an event unlike any other, a gathering of the world's most influential figures, celebrities, politicians, and business tycoons, all dressed in their finest attire. Outside, a long line of luxury cars pulled up one by one, each guest stepping out onto the red carpet, greeted by flashing cameras and murmuring journalists. Among them, Melania Trump stepped out of a sleek black limousine, her presence commanding attention even before she took a single step forward. She was dressed in a breathtaking midnight blue evening gown, its fabric flowing like liquid silk, hugging her figure perfectly. A diamond bracelet adorned her wrist, and her caramel-highlighted hair cascaded in soft waves over her shoulder. Every inch of her exuded grace, confidence, and quiet power. The event was one of the most exclusive of the year, an annual gala known for its selective guest list. Invitations were reserved for the elite, and security was tighter than a presidential briefing. As Melania approached the entrance, heads turned. Some guests whispered amongst themselves, admiring her effortless elegance. Others, however, exchanged smug glances. Near the entrance, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a black tuxedo stood rigidly. James Holloway, the event coordinator. His job was to ensure that only the right kind of people entered the gala. He held a leather-bound guest list in his hands, his sharp eyes scanning names meticulously before allowing guests inside. Melania approached the entrance with her usual poised demeanor. As she neared the security checkpoint, Holloway glanced at her with a practiced smile. But something in his expression shifted. "Good evening, Mrs. Trump," he said, though his voice lacked the warmth he had used for others before her. "I'm afraid there's been an update to the guest list." Melania arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Is that so?" Her voice remained smooth, unbothered. Holloway cleared his throat and tapped the list. "I'm sorry, but your name isn't on here. We're only admitting those personally confirmed by the committee this evening." Melania held his gaze for a long moment. She knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Several of the high-profile attendees nearby pretended not to watch, but their interest was undeniable. A few exchanged knowing looks, subtle smirks playing on their lips. Some of them had never accepted Melania into their elite circles. Not because she lacked grace or sophistication, but because she had never bent to their expectations. A young reporter standing at the edge of the red carpet caught the moment instantly. His eyes widened as he whispered to his cameraman, "Are you getting this? They're denying Melania Trump entry to the most elite event of the year. This is about to be huge." Melania, however, didn't flinch. She didn't argue, didn't demand to be let in. Instead, she did something that caught everyone off guard. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. Gasps rippled through the nearby crowd. A few people murmured in confusion, expecting her to protest, to challenge the insult. But Melania was not a woman who begged for recognition. If they did not wish for her presence, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. As she descended the marble steps, something unexpected happened. A few guests, high-profile figures who had been watching from a distance, began following her. One of them was Isabelle Laurent, a globally renowned fashion designer known for her impeccable eye and deep admiration for real elegance. She had seen enough. She knew how these circles worked. The backroom politics, the manufactured exclusivity, the silent power games. She glanced at the entrance, then at Melania's retreating figure, and without hesitation, she stepped out of line and followed her. Another followed, then another. Within minutes, what had been a mere moment of social snubbing had turned into something else entirely. Melania Trump, without speaking a single word, had shifted the power dynamic. Inside, Holloway felt a sudden unease. The murmurs grew louder. People began checking their phones, where headlines were already surfacing. Melania Trump denied entry to elite gala. Her response shocks everyone. Grace under fire. Melania Trump proves why she's in a league of her own. From the other end of the red carpet, a senior member of the event's board of directors, who had just arrived, noticed the scene unfolding. His brows furrowed as he pulled aside one of the organizers. "What the hell is happening?" he asked. They turned her away," the organizer stammered. The director's face darkened. "You mean to tell me that you just denied entry to one of the most respected women in the world, while letting in reality TV stars and social climbers?" The color drained from Holloway's face as the reality of his decision set in. Outside, Melania had reached the curb. A valet rushed forward to open the car door for her. But before she could step in, Isabel Laurent approached her. "Mrs. Trump," she said out of breath, her voice laced with admiration, "I just wanted to say, I saw what they did, and I saw how you handled it. That was class." Melania offered her the same serene smile. "People show you who they are," she said. "The question is, how do you respond?" Laurent nodded. "With grace," she said, understanding. Just then, a voice from behind interrupted the moment. "Mrs. Trump." Melania turned to see the event director himself hurrying toward her. He was older, dignified, and visibly furious at what had just transpired. "Please," he said, gesturing back toward the entrance. "This was a mistake." "You are, of course. Welcome to join us." Melania tilted her head slightly, considering his words. The energy around her had completely shifted. The same people who had smirked at her earlier now looked uneasy, their confidence rattled. She could walk back in. She could take her rightful place inside that ballroom. But why should she? She had already made her point. She turned to the director, her expression polite but firm. "Thank you," she said, "but I believe I have other plans tonight." With that, she stepped into her car, leaving behind an event that no longer deserved her presence. And as she was driven away, the internet exploded with reactions. Her quiet refusal to demand a seat at the table she wasn't welcomed became the most talked-about moment of the night. Because true class is never about where you're allowed to be. It's about knowing when to walk away. As the black limousine pulled away from the entrance of the Lexington Grand Hotel, Melania Trump sat in the back seat, gazing out at the flashing city lights of New York. Her expression remained poised, as if nothing unusual had just occurred. Inside the ballroom, however, the energy had shifted dramatically. Whispers spread like wildfire, and the weight of what had just happened settled over the attendees. The very woman they had attempted to exclude had left on her own terms, and instead of diminishing her presence, it had only made her more powerful. Journalists who had been covering the event scrambled to write their reports, eager to be the first to publish the story. News outlets flashed headlines within minutes. Melania Trump denied entry, but she left as the real winner. The ultimate power move. Melania walks away with grace, and the world takes notice. Who really lost? Melania's elegant exit sparks outrage at the gala's hypocrisy. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, James Holloway, the man responsible for enforcing the guest list update, was feeling the weight of his decision. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from colleagues, event planners, and even board members demanding an explanation. A few feet away, Isabel Laurent, the celebrated fashion designer who had followed Melania outside, returned inside only to observe the uncomfortable shifting of the so-called elite. She could see it clearly. People were realizing that the biggest mistake of the night was not Melania's exclusion, but rather how they had underestimated her. She leaned toward a fellow designer seated beside her. "You know," she mused, "they tried to take away her seat at the table, and she responded by walking away with the entire room's attention. That's power." Back in the limousine, Melania's assistant, seated across from her, glanced at her phone, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the rapidly evolving news cycle. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, "the media is exploding. Some outlets are calling this a massive mistake on the gala's part. Others are saying you've just redefined what it means to have real influence. Melania remained quiet for a moment before finally speaking. "Let them talk," she said simply, her voice calm. "They always do." Her assistant hesitated before asking, "Would you like to make a statement? We can correct the narrative, address the situation." Melania shook her head slightly, a knowing smile on her lips. "There's nothing to correct," she replied. "The truth is already unfolding." A sudden buzz interrupted them. The assistant checked her phone again and frowned. "You're getting invitations," she said, almost amused. "Several high-profile events are reaching out. Some of them weren't even on your radar before tonight. They want you as their guest." Melania let out a quiet breath. Of course, the moment she had refused to beg for entry into their event, her presence became more desirable than ever. She turned her gaze back to the city, deep in thought. She hadn't left the gala in humiliation. She had left with her dignity intact, and that was something money and status could never buy. The car slowed to a stop in front of a different venue, a charity event that had been happening across town, one that hadn't made the same kind of headlines as the Lexington Gala, but was far more meaningful. The organization hosting it was one that Melania had supported for years, a foundation dedicated to helping underprivileged children gain access to education, mentorship, and scholarships. She stepped out of the car, her gown flowing gracefully behind her, and was immediately met with genuine warmth. Unlike the exclusive gala, this event was filled with people who weren't attending for social status or networking, but because they truly cared about making a difference. A young girl, no older than 13, stood near the entrance, her eyes widening in shock as she recognized Melania. "Mrs. Trump," the girl gasped. Melania smiled gently and knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "Hello," she said warmly. "What's your name?" "Ava," the girl said shyly. I didn't think someone like you would come here." Melania tilted her head slightly. "Why not?" Ava shrugged. "Because you're famous. People like you go to those fancy parties, right?" Melania took the young girl's hands in hers, her voice soft but firm. "Ava, real importance isn't about where you go. It's about what you do when you get there." Ava's face lit up with admiration. Inside the event, people greeted Melania with respect and gratitude, not because of her name, but because of what she represented. She spent time talking with scholarship recipients, meeting families, and engaging in real conversations about change that mattered. Meanwhile, back at the Lexington Grand Hotel, the gala continued, but something had shifted. Some guests, once oblivious to the deeper dynamics of the night, now couldn't stop talking about Melania's departure. The air inside felt less celebratory, more uneasy, as the reality of what had happened settled over the attendees. The event sponsors, realizing the gravity of their mistake, had immediately begun damage control. The board members held impromptu discussions about how to recover from the scandal. They even considered reaching out to Melania with a formal apology and an offer to invite her back as the guest of honor. But it was too late. By the next morning, Melania's choice to walk away had already become the most talked about moment of the entire evening. The media had dubbed it the night Melania Trump stole the spotlight, without even trying. Opinion pieces flooded in, with some journalists admitting that what happened to her was a reflection of the growing elitism in high society, where even the most influential people were judged based on invisible rules. Others pointed out that the very act of exclusion had given Melania more influence than any invitation ever could. And then there were those who simply admired her ability to maintain absolute composure in the face of public rejection. Meanwhile, the young girl from the charity event, Ava, couldn't stop thinking about what Melania had said to her. The next morning, she wrote about it in her journal, vowing that one day she would remember the lesson. True power isn't about forcing your way in. It's about knowing when to walk away. Melania never addressed the incident. She never posted about it, never gave an official comment. She didn't need to, because while the so-called elite were still debating over their mistake, she had already moved forward, where real influence, real dignity, and real respect awaited her. And in the end, That was the only invitation that had ever truly mattered. The next morning, the world was still talking about what had happened. Social media had been flooded with posts, news articles dissected every moment, and headlines across major platforms captured the essence of the night. But while the so-called elite of the Lexington Grand Hotel were still scrambling to do damage control, Melania Trump had already moved on. She spent the morning in quiet reflection, enjoying a peaceful breakfast at home while scrolling through her phone, not for the news, but for messages from the people who truly mattered. Friends, supporters, and even strangers had reached out, praising the way she had handled herself. Her assistant entered the room, hesitating before speaking. "Ma'am, the event organizers from last night have reached out." Melania barely glanced up. "And they want to issue a formal apology," the assistant said, reading off her phone. "They are offering to invite you back next year as an honored guest. They're also willing to make a public statement addressing the mistake." Melania exhaled softly and set down her cup of tea. She had expected this. "No response," she said simply. The assistant looked up. "Nothing at all?" Melania gave a small, knowing smile. "They are only apologizing because the world is watching," she said. "That is not sincerity. That is regret for getting caught." She stood gracefully and walked toward the large glass doors leading to her garden. Outside, the morning sunlight cast a golden glow over the city skyline. The world kept moving forward, and so would she. Elsewhere, the repercussions of the night before were still unfolding. The event coordinator, James Holloway, had been placed under scrutiny for his decision. The event board was discussing whether to remove him altogether, realizing that excluding Melania had backfired in ways they never anticipated. But Melania had never needed their validation, nor did she care for retribution. She had already won. Later that evening, as she attended another gathering, a private charity dinner she had quietly supported for years, she was greeted not with hesitation or judgment, but with genuine warmth and appreciation. People spoke with her, not because of her name, but because of her actions. And as she sat at a table, listening to a young scholar share her dreams for the future, she knew she had made the right choice. She had never needed their exclusive event, because the truth was, they needed her far more than she ever needed them. And that was the real power move.